In the sleepy seaside town of Havens Cove, where the air always carried a hint of salt and the rhythm of life moved with the tides, there lived a woman most people barely noticed. She wasn't flashy, didn't wear bright colors, and never raised her voice above a calm, steady tone. If you passed her on the street, you might nod politely and keep walking, never guessing the quiet depth behind her gentle eyes. She lived in a small, white clapboard house with peeling paint and a garden that bloomed with wildflowers every spring, poppies, daisies, and lavender that swayed in the ocean breeze like they were dancing to a tune only they could hear. Every morning, just after sunrise, she'd step outside in her worn slippers, kettle in hand, and pour the leftover tea from the night before onto the soil near her rose bushes. Plants like a little sweetness, she'd murmur to herself, though no one was around to hear. Her days followed a simple pattern: make breakfast, tidy the house, water the garden, walk to the post office to check her box, which was usually empty, and then head to the community center, where she volunteered 3 afternoons a week, sorting donated books and helping kids find stories that sparked their imaginations. She'd retired a few years back from her job as a school librarian, and though the school missed her calm presence in the reading nook, she never made a fuss about leaving. She believed that when your time in one place was done, it was best to step aside quietly and let someone new take the reins. People in town knew her as that nice woman who lives on Seabreeze Lane, or sometimes just the librarian. Few knew her full name, and even fewer knew anything about her past. She never brought it up. If someone asked how she spent her weekends, she'd say, "Oh, just puttering around the house," or "I like to watch the gulls from the porch." She wasn't being secretive, just private. Some folks assumed she'd always lived this quiet life, that she'd been born into simplicity and never wanted anything more. But that wasn't true, not even close. Long ago, so long that the memory felt like someone else's dream, she had sat on a polished wooden bench in a grand concert hall, fingers flying over gleaming black and white keys while an audience held its breath. She'd worn a black dress that shimmered under the stage lights, her hair pinned neatly back, her heart pounding not from nerves but from pure electric joy. Music had once been her whole world. She'd studied it like a language, practiced until her fingers ached, and dreamed in melodies. But life, as it often does, had other plans. A family emergency, a sudden illness, responsibilities that couldn't be ignored. One by one, the concerts stopped, the recitals faded, and the piano in her apartment gathered dust. Eventually, she sold it to help pay medical bills. And just like that, the music went silent. She didn't regret it. Not really. She believed you did what you had to do for the people you loved. But sometimes, late at night, when the house was still and the only sound was the distant crash of waves against the shore, she'd sit at her kitchen table and tap her fingers lightly on the wood, playing invisible scales, humming a phrase from a Chopin nocturne or a Gershwin tune she used to love. It was her secret ritual, her quiet way of keeping the flame alive even if no one else could see it. The town itself was the kind of place where everyone knew your business, or at least thought they did. The bakery opened at 6, the fish market by 7, and by noon, the same group of retirees would be gathered on the bench outside the post office, arguing good-naturedly about whether the new mayor was doing a decent job. Tourists came in the summer, snapping photos of the lighthouse and buying overpriced seashell necklaces, but by September, the streets would empty again, returning to their usual peaceful rhythm. In a place like this, standing out wasn't encouraged. You kept your head down, minded your own affairs, and offered a kind word when needed. That's exactly how she liked it. Still, she wasn't lonely. She had a few close friends: Maggie from the knitting circle, old Mr. Finch who ran the hardware store and always saved her the best apples, and young Leo, a shy 12-year-old who came to the community center every Tuesday to read adventure stories. Leo didn't talk much, but he'd started leaving little drawings on her desk, sketches of dragons, spaceships, and once a grand piano with a woman playing it. She'd smiled when she saw that one, tucked it into the back of her recipe box, and never mentioned it, but she kept it. Her house reflected her life, simple, clean, full of small treasures. A shelf held seashells collected over decades. A faded photo of her parents sat on the mantel, their faces kind and familiar. In the closet, behind winter coats and spare quilts, was an old leather suitcase that hadn't been opened in 20 years. Inside it were sheet music yellowed with age, and a single program from a student recital dated 1978. She never looked at it, but she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. As the weeks turned into months and summer edged closer, the town began buzzing about the annual Harbor Lights Charity Gala. It was the biggest event of the year, a night of food, music, and fundraising for the local youth center. Everyone went. Fishermen in button-down shirts, shop owners in dresses they only wore once a year, teenagers volunteering as servers, hoping to earn a little extra cash. Tickets sold out fast, and the old community hall would be strung with fairy lights, tables covered in white cloths, and a small stage set up near the back. She hadn't planned to go. She usually skipped big gatherings, preferring the quiet of her porch with a cup of chamomile tea. But Maggie had called one evening, voice full of excitement. "You've got to come this year. They're raising money to fix the roof on the teen room, and Leo's in the planning committee. He's designing the decorations." There was a pause, then softer. "Besides, it'd be nice to see you out and about. You work so hard at the center. You deserve a night off." She'd hesitated, then agreed, not for herself, but for Leo. She knew how proud he'd be to see his work displayed. And maybe, just maybe, it would be nice to sit among familiar faces, eat a slice of cake, and listen to the local band play old standards. She even dug out a dress she hadn't worn in years, a soft blue one with tiny white flowers, still in good shape if a little outdated. She pressed it carefully, polished her one pair of low heels, and set them by the door. The night of the gala arrived with a warm breeze and a sky full of stars. She walked the 10 blocks to the community hall, her heart beating just a little faster than usual. Inside, the room was alive with chatter and laughter. Twinkling lights hung from the ceiling, casting a golden glow over everything. Long tables were filled with people she recognized. Some waved, others smiled in passing. She found a seat near the back next to Maggie, who squeezed her hand and whispered, "You look lovely." She smiled back, then let her eyes wander the room. That's when she saw it. In the far corner, half hidden behind a potted palm and a stack of folding chairs, stood an old upright piano. Its wood was scratched, its keys yellowed with age, and one of the legs looked slightly uneven. She hadn't noticed it before, probably because it was never used. The community center didn't have a pianist, and the instrument had been there for as long as anyone could remember, more like furniture than a musical instrument. Still, something about it tugged at her, not with longing exactly, but with a quiet recognition, like meeting an old friend you hadn't seen in decades. She looked away, sipped her water, and listened as the MC took the stage, a cheerful man in a slightly too tight suit who owned half the rental properties in town. He thanked everyone for coming, praised the volunteers, and announced the fundraising total so far. Then, grinning, he said, "Now we've got a little surprise for you. You all know that old piano in the corner? Well, rumor has it hasn't played a proper note since the 1960s. But hey, maybe tonight's the night it wakes up." The crowd chuckled. He scanned the room playfully. "Any brave souls want to give it a try? Don't worry. We won't hold it against you if it sounds like a cat in a washing machine." More laughter. People shook their heads, waved him off. No one stepped forward. Then his eyes landed on her. She didn't know why. Maybe because she was sitting so still, or maybe because she was the only one looking at the piano instead of him. He pointed, still smiling. "How about you? You've got that calm look, like you could tame a wild horse. Or a broken piano." The room turned to look. She felt her cheeks warm. Maggie gave her arm a gentle nudge, half joking, half curious. "Go on," she whispered. "It's just for fun." She didn't move at first. Part of her wanted to stay seated, to shake her head and disappear back into the background where she belonged. But another part, the part that still hummed melodies in the dark, stirred awake. It wasn't pride. It wasn't a desire to show off. It was something deeper, quieter, a sense that maybe, just this once, it was okay to let a little light in. So she stood. Her legs felt unsteady, but her hands were calm. She smoothed her dress, took a slow breath, and walked toward the piano, not with drama, not with hesitation, but with the same quiet certainty she used to water her roses or help a child find the right book. The room grew still, not because they expected greatness, but because her calmness was unexpected. Who was this woman, walking so steadily toward a joke? She reached the piano. Up close, it looked even more neglected. Dust coated the top, and the bench creaked as she sat. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys. Some stuck. Others made no sound at all. The middle C was badly out of tune, wobbling like a tired voice. She closed her eyes for just a second. Not in prayer, but in memory. Then she placed her hands on the keys and the room held its breath, not knowing they were about to witness something no one saw coming. But that moment, the music, the gasps, the stunned silence would come later. For now, in this quiet beginning, she was just a woman in a blue dress, sitting at a broken piano in a room full of strangers, about to do something she hadn't done in over 40 years, and no one, least of all herself, knew what would happen next. The man at the microphone wasn't unkind, just loud, confident, and used to being the center of attention. He owned half the vacation rentals in town and always showed up to events in a suit that looked like it had been picked out by someone who thought formal meant shiny. He'd hosted the Harbor Lights Gala for years, and his routine was the same every time. Thank the sponsors, crack a few jokes, and stir up some harmless fun to keep the energy high. That night, he'd spotted the old piano tucked in the corner and thought, why not? It was dusty, probably unplayable, and hadn't been touched in decades. A perfect prop for a laugh. When he pointed toward the woman in the blue dress, it wasn't meant to be cruel. He barely knew her, just recognized her as the quiet one who helped at the community center, the one who always smiled but never said much. He figured she'd wave him off with a chuckle, maybe shrug and say, "Oh, I haven't touched a piano since I was a girl." And that would be that. A light moment, a shared laugh, then back to the auction and the cake. But she stood up. That surprised him. It surprised everyone. She didn't stride dramatically across the room. She didn't flash a defiant look or make a speech. She just rose from her chair like it was the most natural thing in the world, smoothed her dress with calm hands, and walked toward the piano as if she'd been heading there all evening. The chatter in the room dipped. Glasses stopped clinking. Even the band members, who'd been packing up their instruments after their set, paused and turned to watch. People exchanged glances. Is she really going to try? Does she even know how? That piano hasn't worked since the Carter administration. But no one said anything out loud. There was something about the way she moved, so steady, so unhurried, that made them hold their words. It wasn't showmanship. It was something quieter, deeper, like she wasn't doing this for them at all. She reached the piano and stood beside it for a moment, looking down at the yellowed keys. Dust motes floated in the soft light above her. Someone near the front whispered, "Bless her heart," thinking she was about to embarrass herself in the kindest possible way. She sat. The bench groaned under her weight, one leg slightly shorter than the others, tilting her just a bit to the left. She adjusted without fuss, sliding forward until her arms hung comfortably over the keys. Then she did something no one expected. She ran her fingers lightly across the keyboard, not pressing down, just feeling the surface. Her touch was gentle, almost reverent, like she was greeting an old friend who'd fallen on hard times. A few people chuckled nervously. One man muttered, "Hope she doesn't break a nail." But then she paused. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breathing slowed. And for the first time that evening, the room felt still, not awkwardly silent, but deeply quiet. The kind of hush that comes before something important begins. She lifted her hands, hovered them over the keys, and then hesitated. Not out of fear, not out of doubt, but because she was listening. Listening to the room, to the piano, to the memory of music that had lived inside her for so long it felt like part of her bones. Then she played. The first note came out thin and slightly sour. The middle C was badly out of tune, wobbling like a voice on the edge of tears. A few people winced. Someone in the back snorted softly. But she didn't stop. She leaned into it, let the imperfection hang in the air for just a heartbeat, and then wove it into the next phrase like it belonged there. What followed wasn't just playing. It was storytelling. She chose a piece most people wouldn't recognize by name, but its melody was familiar in the way old lullabies are. Gentle, aching, full of longing. It was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Opera 9, No. 2, though no one in the room would have known that. They only knew that something inside them shifted when she began. Her fingers moved with a grace that defied her age, her plain dress, her unassuming presence. They danced over the keys, skipping the ones that stuck, softening the ones that shrieked, turning the piano's flaws into part of the song. When a key refused to sound, she'd glide around it with a trill or a grace note, making it feel intentional, even beautiful. When the bass notes rattled like loose teeth, she played them so softly they became whispers instead of groans. The room didn't just listen, They were pulled in. The man who'd joked about the piano stood frozen at the microphone, his grin long gone. The woman who'd whispered "bless her heart" now had tears in her eyes, though she didn't know why. Teenagers who'd been scrolling on their phones looked up, then quickly put their devices away as if it felt wrong to look at anything else. Even the air seemed to change. The clatter of dishes from the kitchen faded. The breeze through the open windows carried the scent of jasmine instead of fried food. Time didn't stop, but it slowed, stretching like taffy, giving everyone space to feel something they hadn't expected to feel that night. She wasn't performing. That was the strangest part. She wasn't smiling for the crowd or nodding to acknowledge their awe. Her eyes were half closed, her focus turned inward, as if she were playing for someone only she could see. Maybe her younger self, maybe a parent long gone, maybe the music itself. And because she wasn't playing for them, they felt honored just to witness it. Halfway through, a child, no older than 6, slipped from her mother's lap and crept toward the piano, stopping just a few feet away. She sat cross-legged on the floor, chin in her hands, staring up at the woman's hands like they were magic. No one told her to move. No one shushed her. They all just watched, breath held, as if the slightest sound might break the spell. And then, just as gently as it began, the music ended. She played the final chord, a soft, unresolved harmony that hung in the air like a question, and let her hands rest on the keys. For a long moment, no one moved. No one clapped. They were still inside the feeling, not ready to come out. Then, from the back of the room, someone started to clap. It was slow at first, just one pair of hands. Then another, until the whole room rose to their feet. Not out of politeness, but out of pure, unfiltered awe. The applause wasn't loud or chaotic. It was deep, steady, full of respect. People wiped their eyes. Someone whispered, "I didn't know." I had no idea. She didn't stand right away. She stayed seated, hands still on the keys, as if saying goodbye. Then slowly she rose, gave a small nod. Not a bow, just a quiet acknowledgement, and walked back to her seat. Her face was calm, but her hands trembled slightly at her sides. Maggie grabbed her arm the moment she sat down. You play like that?" she whispered, voice thick with emotion. "All this time?" She just shook her head slightly, as if to say, "It's nothing." It was just a song, but it wasn't nothing. And everyone in that room knew it. The MC finally found his voice. He stepped back to the mic, cleared his throat, and said, "Well, I think we just witnessed something truly special. Let's give her another round of applause." The room erupted again, louder this time, but she kept her eyes down, staring at her lap like she wanted to disappear. After that, the gala changed. The auction felt less important. The cake tasted sweeter, but no one was really thinking about dessert. People kept glancing at her, not with curiosity anymore, but with something like reverence. A few came over to thank her, to say how moved they were, but she answered each one with the same quiet humility. "Thank you," or "I'm glad you liked it," or simply a warm smile. No one asked how she learned to play. No one asked why she'd never played in public before. They sensed somehow that those questions weren't theirs to ask. Not yet. Later, as the night wound down and volunteers began stacking chairs, a young man from the local newspaper approached her. He'd been covering the gala for the town's weekly paper. "Would you mind if I wrote a little piece about tonight?" he asked gently. "Not a big feature, just people should know." She hesitated, then nodded. "Just don't make it about me," she said. "Make it about the music, or the piano, or the kids who'll benefit from the fundraiser." He promised he would. As she walked home that night, the streets were quiet. The moon hung low over the water, casting a silver path across the waves. Her heels clicked softly on the pavement, but her mind was far away. Back in that room, back at the piano, back in a time when music was her whole world. She didn't feel proud. She didn't feel exposed. She felt seen, not for what she'd done, but for who she'd always been, even when no one was looking. And for the first time in decades, that felt okay. When she reached her house, she didn't go straight inside. She stood on the porch for a long time, listening to the ocean, feeling the cool night air on her skin. Then very softly, she hummed the last few notes of the nocturne, the same ones she'd played on the broken piano. This time they sounded perfect. Inside, the house was dark and still. She kicked off her shoes, hung up her blue dress, and made a cup of chamomile tea. As she sat at the kitchen table, steam curling from the mug, she thought about Leo, the quiet boy from the community center. She wondered if he'd been there tonight. She hoped he had. She hoped he'd seen that sometimes. The quietest people carry the loudest beauty inside them. She didn't know it yet, but her life was about to change. Not in a dramatic overnight way, but in small, steady ripples. The kind that start with a single note on a broken piano and end up touching more hearts than she could ever imagine. But for now, in the quiet of her kitchen with the sound of the sea in the distance and the memory of music still warm in her chest, she was exactly where she needed to be, and that was enough. The morning after the gala, the town woke up different, not in any big, obvious way, but in the quiet shifts that happen when something real has touched people. At the bakery, the usual chatter over coffee turned to hushed awe. "Did you hear her play?" one woman asked, stirring honey into her tea. "I swear I got goosebumps." At the post office, the line moved slower than usual because everyone was talking about the same thing. The woman in the blue dress, the broken piano, and the music that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the room. She, meanwhile, woke up as she always did just before sunrise, to the sound of gulls crying over the water. She made her bed, put the kettle on, and stepped outside in her slippers to water the roses. The world looked the same. The sky was pale pink. The neighbor's cat stretched on the fence. Nothing had changed, except everything had. By mid-morning, the phone started ringing. First, it was Maggie, voice trembling with excitement. "They're calling you the Angel of Havens Cove on the community Facebook page. Someone posted a video. It's already got hundreds of views." She didn't have Facebook, didn't even own a smartphone, so she just listened, nodding as if Maggie could see her through the phone. "That's nice," she said softly. But it was just a little tune. Then came the local reporter, the young man from the gala. He'd stayed up half the night writing his piece, and now he wanted to stop by, just for a few minutes, to ask a couple more questions. She almost said no. But then she remembered Leo, and how much the youth center needed that roof repaired. If her story could help raise more money, then maybe it was worth a few uncomfortable minutes. She tidied the living room, wiped down the kitchen table, and put out 2 mugs just in case he wanted tea. When he arrived, he wasn't what she expected. No notepad, no recorder, just a small notebook and a kind smile. He sat at her kitchen table like he belonged there and asked gentle questions. "When did you start playing? Did you ever perform professionally? Why did you stop?" She answered carefully, not with secrets, but with truth wrapped in simplicity. "I started when I was 6. My mother saved for a year to buy me a second-hand piano. I practiced every day after school, even when I didn't feel like it." She paused, stirring her tea. "I studied at a music school for a while, but then my father got sick. I came home to help. Life just took a different turn." He didn't push. He didn't ask for drama or tears. He just listened, and when he left, he said, "Thank you for trusting me with that." 2 days later, the article appeared in the town paper. It wasn't flashy. No big headline like "Secret Piano Prodigy Uncovered." Instead, it was titled simply, "A Note of Grace, How One Woman's Music Moved a Town." It told her story without exaggeration, her years as a librarian, her quiet life, the surprise performance, and her wish that the attention be turned toward the youth center's fundraiser. At the end, he wrote, "Sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that speak only when needed, and when they do, the world leans in to listen." People read it over breakfast. They pass the paper around at the diner. Teachers read it aloud to their students, and slowly something beautiful began to happen. Donations started pouring in, not just for the roof but for the whole youth center. A retired carpenter offered to fix the piano for free. A music teacher from the next town over called to ask if she'd consider giving lessons. A local cafe owner asked if she'd be willing to play once a month during their Sunday brunch. She said no to most of it, not out of pride, but because she didn't want this to become a show. Music to her wasn't entertainment. It was connection, and she wasn't sure she was ready to share that part of herself with the world again. But then Leo showed up at her door. He stood on her porch with his hands shoved deep in his hoodie pockets, eyes downcast, shuffling his sneakers on the welcome mat. She opened the door and smiled. "Well, hello. Come in." He stepped inside, glanced around like he was seeing her house for the first time, then blurted out, Did you really play piano like that your whole life and never tell anyone? She chuckled softly. Not my whole life. And I didn't tell anyone because it wasn't really anyone's business. Music was just mine. He nodded slowly, then pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It was a drawing, just like the ones he used to leave on her desk at the community center. But this one was different. It showed the gala room, the twinkling lights, the crowd standing in awe, and in the center a woman at a piano, her hands glowing like they were made of light. At the bottom, in careful handwriting, he'd written, "You made the room feel like magic." Her throat tightened. She didn't trust herself to speak for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Leo. That means more than you know." He looked up, eyes bright. "Can you teach me? Not to be famous or anything, just so I can make something beautiful too." That was the moment she said yes, not to the cafe, not to the newspaper interviews, but to Leo, because he wasn't asking for a performance. He was asking for a gift, and she knew what it was like to need one. She didn't have a piano, of course. But the community center did now, or at least it would soon. The retired carpenter had already started working on it, sanding the wood, replacing broken hammers, tuning what he could. He said it might never be concert quality, but it would sing again, and that was enough. The next week, she walked into the community center not as a volunteer sorting books, but as a teacher. Leo was waiting, sitting on the floor with a notebook full of scribbled notes about chords and scales he'd looked up online. She sat beside him and began not with technique, but with listening. "Close your eyes," she said. "What do you hear right now?" He frowned. The AC humming? Mrs. Callahan vacuuming down the hall?" She smiled. "Good, now listen deeper. Underneath all that, what's the silence sound like?" He didn't answer right away, but after a few seconds, his shoulders relaxed. "It's calm," he whispered. "That's where music starts," she said. "Not with noise, with quiet." They met every Tuesday and Thursday after school. She taught him how to sit at the bench, how to curve his fingers, how to press a key without banging. She showed him how to find middle C, how to count beats, how to let a note breathe. He was clumsy at first, his fingers too stiff, his rhythm off, but he never gave up. And when he played a simple scale correctly for the first time, his face lit up like he'd discovered a secret language. Word got around. Other kids started hanging around the music room during their breaks, peeking through the door. One girl asked if she could learn too. Then another. Soon she was teaching a small group. 4 kids, ages 10 to 14, all beginners, all curious, all a little nervous. She didn't charge a dime. She didn't need to. Seeing Leo's confidence grow, watching a shy girl finally play Twinkle Twinkle without stopping, hearing a boy laugh when he got a chord right, that was payment enough. Meanwhile, the restored piano arrived back at the community center. It wasn't perfect. The high note still had a slight buzz and the pedal squeaked, but it worked. And when she sat down and played a simple folk tune for the kids, they gathered around like it was a campfire story. People in town started treating her differently, not with pity or curiosity, but with quiet respect. The fisherman at the market would save her the best cod. The librarian at the public library reserved new books for her before they hit the shelves. No one made a fuss. They just showed up in small, steady ways to say, "We see you. We're glad you're here." One afternoon, as she walked home from the center, she passed the cafe where the owner had asked her to play. Through the window, she saw a young woman sitting at a small keyboard in the corner, playing soft jazz for the lunch crowd. The woman looked nervous, fingers fumbling over a tricky passage. But no one was laughing. People were listening, smiling, sipping their coffee like it tasted better with music in the air. She stood there for a long time, watching. And for the first time, she understood something. Her moment at the gala hadn't just been about her. It had reminded everyone that beauty can show up in the most ordinary places, in a broken piano, in a quiet woman, in a town that thought it had seen it all. She still didn't want fame. She still preferred her garden, her tea, her quiet evenings. But she no longer felt the need to hide. Music wasn't a secret anymore. It was a bridge, and she was finally willing to walk across it. A few weeks later, the youth center held a small recital. Just the kids, their families, and a few neighbors. No fancy lights, no microphone. Just chairs in a circle and the old piano in the middle. Leo played first, a simple piece he'd written himself, full of mistakes but full of heart. The others followed, each one nervous but proud. When it was over, the parents clapped and cried and hugged their children. And then someone called out, "Will you play something for us?" She hesitated. But then she looked at Leo, who was beaming at her like she was his hero, and she knew she couldn't say no. She sat at the piano and played the same Chopin nocturne from the gala, but this time it wasn't for strangers. It was for the kids who'd learned to listen, for the carpenter who'd fixed the keys, for the town that had opened its heart without asking for anything in return. And as the music filled the room, no one thought about how broken the piano had once been. They only heard the beauty it could still make, and the woman who knew how to bring it out. That night back on her porch, she didn't hum the melody. She just sat in the quiet, listening to the waves, feeling the warmth of the day still in her bones. She wasn't the same woman who'd walked into the gala 2 months ago. She wasn't hiding anymore, but she wasn't changed either. She was just more herself. And in that simple truth, there was everything. The days after the little recital at the youth center settled into a new kind of rhythm, one that still felt like hers, but now carried a soft hum of connection she hadn't known she'd been missing. She still rose before dawn, still watered her roses with yesterday's tea, still folded her laundry with the same careful creases. But now when she walked down Seabreeze Lane, people didn't just nod politely, they stopped to talk. Not about the gala, not about the piano, but about their kids, the weather, the new bakery that opened near the docks. It was as if her quiet act of playing had reminded everyone that kindness doesn't need a spotlight to matter. Still, she kept her boundaries. She said no to the radio interview. She politely declined when a regional arts council asked if she'd perform at their annual fundraiser. She wasn't running from attention, she just knew her limits. Music for her had never been about stages or applause. It was about feeling, about truth, about the space between notes where real life lived. And she wasn't ready to turn that into a performance for strangers. But life has a way of nudging even the most careful hearts. One rainy Thursday afternoon, as she was helping Leo practice a new scale, his fingers finally starting to move with something close to grace, a woman walked into the community center. She wasn't from town. Her coat was too fancy for Havens Cove, her shoes too clean for the salt-stained sidewalks. She stood near the doorway, watching quietly as the lesson unfolded. When the hour ended and Leo packed up his notebook with a shy "See you Tuesday," the woman stepped forward. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, voice soft but steady. "My name is Clara. I run a music outreach program for seniors and at-risk youth in the next county over. I read about you in the paper, and then I saw the video someone posted online." She didn't flinch. She'd heard about the video. Maggie had shown her a blurry clip on her tablet, the kind filmed on a phone from the back of the room. She hadn't watched it all the way through. It felt too strange seeing herself like that. "I'm not looking for a performer," Clara continued quickly as if sensing her hesitation. "I'm looking for a teacher, someone who understands that music isn't about perfection, it's about healing. We've got a dozen kids who've been through things no child should go through. And a group of older folks in the assisted living home who haven't touched an instrument since they were young. They're lonely. They're quiet, just like you used to be." She looked down at her hands that had spent decades turning pages, folding laundry, planting seeds. Hands that, only recently, had remembered how to speak in melody. "I don't have a studio," she said simply. "I don't even have a piano at home." Clara smiled. "We do, and we'll bring it to you. Or you can come to us. No pressure, just consider it." She didn't say yes that day, but she didn't say no either. That night she sat on her porch longer than usual, listening to the rain tap against the roof like gentle fingers on a drum. She thought about the kids Clara mentioned, kids who'd lost parents, who'd been shuffled between homes, who carried silence like armor. She thought about the older folks sitting in rooms with too much quiet, wondering if anyone remembered they were once young, once full of dreams. She remembered her own silence. The years she tucked her music away because there wasn't room for it in a life full of duty. She hadn't resented it, but she knew what it felt like to have a part of yourself go unheard. 2 days later, she called Clara. "I'll try," she said. "Just one session. To see." The first visit was to the assisted living home, a low brick building on the edge of town surrounded by gardens that were tended with care but rarely visited. Clara met her at the entrance with a portable keyboard and a stack of beginner sheet music. "They're nervous," she whispered. Most haven't played in 50 years. Some never learned at all. Inside, a small group waited in the sunroom. 6 residents, all in their 80s and 90s, seated in armchairs arranged in a loose circle. One woman clutched a faded photo of a young man in a soldier's uniform. Another tapped her foot restlessly, eyes distant. A man in a cardigan stared out the window, as if expecting someone who would never come. She didn't start with scales or theory. She sat at the keyboard, played a few simple chords, and asked, "Does anyone remember a song from when you were young?" At first, silence. Then the woman with the photo murmured, "Moonlight Serenade. My husband used to whistle it when he came home from work." She nodded, found the melody in her memory, and played it slowly, softly, letting the notes hang in the air like old photographs brought to life. The woman closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she was smiling. By the end of the hour, 3 of them were trying to play "You Are My Sunshine" with trembling fingers. It was messy, off-key, beautiful. When she left, the man in the cardigan caught her hand and said, "Thank you for bringing back a piece of my wife. She loved that song." Her throat tightened. She just squeezed his hand and walked out. The next week, she went to the youth center Clara ran in the neighboring town. It was smaller than Havens Cove's, tucked behind a church with peeling paint and a playground missing 2 swings. Inside, 5 teenagers sat slouched in chairs, arms crossed, eyes guarded. They didn't look up when she entered. Clara introduced her quickly, then left, saying, "They'll warm up. Or they won't. Either way, just be you." She sat at the piano in the corner, a donated upright, slightly better than the one at her own center, and played nothing at first. Just waited. After a long silence, one boy muttered, "You really played that thing at the gala? Looked like it was held together with duct tape." She smiled. "It was. Still sounded okay, though." He snorted. "My grandma's got a piano like that. Key stick. She says it's haunted." "Maybe it is," she said. "Maybe it's full of all the songs people never got to finish." That made him look at her. Really look, she didn't ask them to play. Instead, she asked what kind of music they liked. One liked hip-hop beats. Another loved old soul singers. A girl in the back whispered, "My mom used to sing lullabies," before she left. No one said anything for a moment. Then she played a simple version of "Ain't No Sunshine," weaving in a bass line that echoed the hip-hop rhythm the first boy liked. She didn't make it fancy. She made it real. By the 3rd visit, the girl in the back was sitting at the piano, learning to play the opening notes. The boy who'd called the piano haunted was tapping out rhythms on the bench, trying to match the beat in his head. They weren't prodigies. They weren't even consistent. But they were showing up, and that was everything. Back in Havens Cove, her own little group of students was growing, not in number but in confidence. Leo had started composing short pieces, scribbling notes in a battered notebook. The shy girl now played for Elise with steady hands. Even the carpenter who'd fixed the piano stopped by sometimes just to listen, his calloused hands resting on his knees like he was praying. One evening, as she locked up the community center, Maggie pulled up in her old station wagon. "Hop in," she said. "There's something you need to see." She hesitated, then got in. They drove to the edge of town, past the lighthouse, to a small field where wildflowers bloomed in spring. But it wasn't flowers Maggie wanted her to see. It was a bench. Carved into the wood were words, "For the woman who reminded us that broken things can still sing." Below it, dozens of small handprints, some child-sized, some adult, had been pressed into the wet cement before it dried. Names were etched beside them. Leo, Mrs. Callahan, the carpenter, even the MC from the gala. She stood there for a long time, rain beginning to fall again, mixing with the tears she didn't try to hide. "They wanted to name the music room after you," Maggie said gently, "but I told them you'd hate that. So we did this instead." She touched the bench, her fingers tracing the grooves of the letters. "It's too much," she whispered. "No," Maggie said. "It's just enough." After that, she stopped saying no quite so often. She agreed to play once a month at the cafe, not for money, but for the joy of it. She let Clara list her as a volunteer teacher for the outreach program. She even let the local paper take a photo of her with her students, though she made them promise not to put it on the front page. Most importantly, she started playing at home again, not on a real piano, she still didn't have one, but she bought a small digital keyboard, the kind with weighted keys that felt almost real, She set it on her kitchen table, right by the window where the morning light spilled in. And every day after watering the roses, she'd sit and play for 20 minutes. Sometimes scales, sometimes old concert pieces, sometimes just whatever came to her in the moment. Neighbors began to stop on their walk, standing quietly outside her gate, listening. No one knocked. No one interrupted. They just stood, let the music wash over them, and walked on, lighter somehow. One afternoon, as she played a quiet version of Over the Rainbow, she realized something. She wasn't hiding anymore. Not from her past, not from her gift, not from the quiet truth that she mattered. Not because she was famous, but because she showed up with kindness and honesty, exactly as she was, and that, she thought, was the most beautiful music of all. The town didn't throw her a parade. There were no headlines beyond the local paper. But in the way people greeted her, in the way children waved when she passed the school, in the way the piano at the community center was always left open and waiting, she knew she'd found something rare, not fame, belonging, and, for a woman who'd spent decades believing her music was too small for the world, that was more than enough. It was everything. Time moved gently in Havens Cove like waves rolling in and out with no hurry. Seasons changed. The wildflowers bloomed, the tourists came and went. The gulls returned to their nests on the cliffs, and through it all, the woman in the blue dress settled into a life that felt more like a home than it ever had before. She still lived in the same white house with the peeling paint. She still watered her roses with leftover tea. But now when she sat on her porch in the evenings, she wasn't just listening to the ocean. She was listening to something deeper, the quiet hum of belonging, the soft echo of music that no longer lived only inside her, but rippled out into the world around her. The piano at the community center had a new name now. People didn't call it the old upright or that broken thing in the corner. They called it Ellie's Keys. No one had voted on it. It just happened, like the way daisies grow where you didn't plant them, naturally without force. The carpenter who'd fixed it had carved those words into a small wooden plaque and hung it above the music stand. She'd blushed when she saw it, but she didn't take it down. She knew it wasn't really about her. It was about what the piano had become, a place where kids found their voices, where seniors remembered their youth, where silence turned into song. Every Tuesday and Thursday, the music room filled with the sound of learning, not perfect, not polished, but alive. Leo was the first to play a full piece from memory, his fingers finally moving with the confidence he'd once only dreamed of. The shy girl started writing her own melodies, simple tunes about stars and seashells. Even the teenager from the outreach program in the next town began showing up on weekends, riding his bike all the way across the bridge just to practice on Ellie's Keys. He never said much, but he always left a small drawing on the piano bench. A bird in flight, a rising sun, once a pair of hands playing side by side. She didn't teach them to be performers. She taught them to listen, to the music, to each other, to the quiet spaces between the notes where truth often hides. Music isn't about getting it right, she'd say, sitting beside a frustrated student whose fingers kept slipping. It's about showing up even when it's hard. That's where the beauty is. And slowly, without fanfare, that lesson began to spread. The youth center didn't just raise money for the roof anymore. It became a hub for creativity. A local artist started a mural on the outside wall. Children playing instruments, books floating like birds, a piano with wings. A retired choir director offered free singing lessons on Saturdays. Even the cafe owner began hosting open mic Sundays where anyone, kids, grandparents, fishermen with off-key voices, could share a song, a poem, or just a story. The town hadn't planned it. It just grew, like a garden tended by many hands. She still played at the cafe once a month. Not on a stage, just at the small piano in the corner while people sipped coffee and ate scones. No one clapped loudly or recorded her. They just listened, then went back to their conversations, carrying the music with them like a warm coat on a cool day. Sometimes after she finished, someone would say, "That made my day better," and she'd just smile and say, "Good, that's what it's for." One spring morning, as she was walking to the post office, she passed the hardware store. The old man who ran it waved her in. "Got something for you," he said, handing her a small envelope. Inside was a letter from a woman in another state, someone she'd never met. The woman wrote that she'd seen the video of the gala online, shared by her daughter. "I lost my husband last year," the letter said. "I hadn't played piano in 30 years. But after watching you, I sat down at our old upright and played Clair de Lune for the first time since we danced to it at our wedding. Thank you for reminding me that joy doesn't expire." She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket. That night she played Clair de Lune on her kitchen keyboard, not for anyone but herself, and for the woman far away who needed to hear it too. Her own past no longer felt like a secret she had to guard. She'd opened the old leather suitcase in the closet one rainy afternoon and gone through the yellowed sheet music, the recital program from 1978. She didn't cry. She just smiled, ran her fingers over the notes, and put it all back, this time on a shelf in the living room, where the light could touch it. She even started playing again in public, not for charity, not for attention, but because it felt right. At the summer solstice festival, she played a short set under the stars. At the winter holiday gathering, she led the crowd in carols, her voice soft but sure. Each time, people gathered not because they expected a show, but because they knew they'd leave feeling a little more human. Leo graduated from middle school that year. At the ceremony, instead of a speech, he played a piece he'd written himself, "For the Woman Who Taught Me to Listen." It wasn't perfect. He missed a note near the end. But when he looked up at her from the piano, his eyes shining, she knew it was the most honest music she'd ever heard. Afterward, he handed her a small box. Inside was a keychain made of driftwood, carved into the shape of a piano key. "So you never forget you unlocked something in all of us," he said. She put it on her house keys that very day. Life wasn't suddenly easy. There were still rainy days when the piano keys stuck. There were students who quit, days when she felt too tired to teach, moments when the old doubt whispered, "Who are you to think your music matters?" But now she had an answer. It matters because it helps someone else feel seen. And that was enough. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the sky in gold and lavender, Maggie came by with a slice of peach pie. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the waves. Then Maggie said, "You know, before that night at the gala, I thought I knew you. Quiet librarian, good with kids, great with roses, but I had no idea there was all that music inside you." She smiled. "I didn't either, not for a long time. I thought I'd left it behind." "You didn't leave it," Maggie said gently. "You just waited until the world was ready to hear it." She looked out at the ocean, the same view she'd seen for decades, but now it felt different, fuller somehow. Not because the water had changed, but because she had. She still didn't seek the spotlight. She turned down a request to appear on a regional TV segment. She politely declined when a music school asked her to join their faculty. Her place wasn't in grand halls or on screens. It was here, in the community center, in the cafe corner, in the quiet moments when a child finally played a song without fear. And that was exactly where she wanted to be. Years later, long after the video of the gala had faded from the internet, long after the plaque on the piano had weathered to a soft gray, people in Havens Cove would still tell the story. Not as a tale of sudden fame, but as a reminder that greatness doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears a simple dress, waters roses with old tea, and plays a broken piano not for glory, but because the music needs to be heard. And on quiet nights, if you walked past her house, you might still hear it, the soft sound of keys being pressed, a melody drifting through the open window, mingling with the sound of the sea. Not loud, not showy, just true. She never became famous. She never needed to. She became herself. And in doing so, she gave everyone around her permission to do the same. That, more than any performance, was her real legacy. Not in headlines or recordings, but in the way a town learned to listen, to each other and to the quiet beauty that lives in ordinary hearts. And as the stars came out one by one above Havens Cove, she closed her keyboard, made a cup of chamomile tea, and sat on the porch, humming softly, not because anyone was listening, but because her heart was full, and sometimes that's reason enough to sing. The story was never meant to have a sixth part. After all, the journey had come full circle. Quiet woman, broken piano, music reborn, community changed. It felt complete, like the final chord of a well-played song. But life, as it often does, kept going. And sometimes the most meaningful moments happen not in the spotlight, but in the gentle afterglow when no one's watching, and everything is exactly as it should be. A year had passed since that night at the gala. The seasons had turned twice, the wildflowers had bloomed and faded, and the town had settled into a new rhythm, one where music wasn't an event, but a thread woven into everyday life. The cafe still hosted open mic Sundays. The youth center still echoed with hesitant scales and sudden bursts of laughter, and every Tuesday and Thursday the old piano in the corner, now lovingly known as Ellie's Keys, sang again. Not because it was perfect, but because it was loved. She still lived in the same white house. The paint was still peeling in places, but someone, no one ever admitted who, had quietly repainted the front steps last spring. Her garden was fuller than ever, spilling over with lavender, poppies, and a new patch of sunflowers that turned their faces to follow the sun. She'd planted them after Leo left for high school in the next town, a quiet tribute to the boy who'd once drawn her playing with hands made of light. She missed him, of course, but he called every Sunday evening, and sometimes when he came home on weekends, he'd sit at the kitchen table with his notebook and play her the new pieces he was working on, jazz riffs, classical etudes, even a song he'd written about the ocean at dawn. She'd listen, eyes closed, and say, "You're finding your own voice now." That's the best part. He'd grin. "Only because you taught me how to listen." She didn't correct him. She knew better. No one teaches another person to listen. They just create a space where it's safe to try. Her teaching had grown, but not in the way most would expect. She hadn't opened a studio or hired assistants. Instead, she'd started something quieter. Listening circles. Once a month, she'd invite anyone, kids, elders, newcomers, longtime residents, to gather in the community center, not to perform, but simply to share a song, a memory, or even a silence. No judgment. No applause unless it came naturally. Just presence. At first, only a few showed up, then more. A retired fisherman brought his old harmonica and played a tune his grandfather taught him. A young mother sang a lullaby in a language no one recognized, her baby asleep in her arms. An elderly man who hadn't spoken much since his wife passed sat at the piano and played 3 notes over and over. "Our song," he whispered. No one asked for more. They just sat with him in it. These circles became sacred in their simplicity. Not therapy, not entertainment. Just human beings remembering they weren't alone. One rainy afternoon, as she was tidying up after a circle, Clara, the woman from the outreach program, stopped by with a thermos of soup and a tired smile. "You've inspired something bigger than you know," she said, handing her a folded brochure. It was for a new statewide initiative called Broken Instruments. Whole Hearts went a program that collected old, unused pianos and repaired them for community centers, schools, and senior homes. At the bottom of the page in small print was a quote, "A broken piano can still sing if someone believes in its voice." Below it, a photo of Ellie's Keys, slightly out of focus, but unmistakable. She looked up, surprised. "You didn't," Clara shrugged. "I didn't have to. People kept telling your story. It just grew." She didn't feel proud. She felt responsible, not in a heavy way, but in the way a gardener feels responsible for seeds they've scattered. Hopeful, tender, aware that what grows next isn't theirs to control, only to nurture. That week, she received a package from a piano technician 3 towns over. Inside was a small hand-carved wooden music box. When she opened it, it played a few bars of the Chopin Nocturne, the very piece she'd played that night at the gala. Tucked beneath it was a note. "Thank you for reminding us that music isn't about the instrument. It's about the heart behind it." She kept the music box on her windowsill. Some mornings she'd wind it just to hear those few notes drift through the room like a whisper from the past. Life wasn't without its quiet sorrows. Old Mr. Finch from the hardware store passed away that winter. She played at his memorial, a simple folk tune he used to hum while fixing leaky faucets. His daughter gave her his favorite wrench afterward. "So you'll always have a piece of him when you fix things." She hung it on a hook by the back door, next to her gardening gloves. Grief, she'd learned, didn't cancel joy. They could live in the same room, like 2 old friends who'd seen hard times but still shared tea every morning. Her own health wasn't what it used to be. Her fingers sometimes ached in the cold and she tired more easily. But she refused to stop teaching. Instead, she adapted. On days when her hands were stiff, she'd sit with students and guide them by ear. "Listen to the space between the notes," she'd say. "That's where the feeling lives." She taught them to trust their instincts more than their sheet music, to play from memory, from emotion, from the quiet truth inside them. And in doing so, she found a new kind of strength, not in perfection, but in presence. One spring day, a letter arrived from the State Arts Council. They wanted to honor her with a Community Legacy Award, a small ceremony, a plaque, a modest grant for the Youth Center's music program. She almost said no. Awards made her uncomfortable, but then she thought of the roof that still leaked in heavy rain, of the keyboard that needed replacing, of the kids who deserved better than duct-taped equipment. So she said yes. The ceremony was held in the same community hall where it all began. The piano was gone now, replaced by a proper stage, but the fairy lights were the same, twinkling like stars caught in fishing nets. The room was full, not with strangers, but with faces she knew. Maggie, the carpenter. Leo, home for the weekend. Clara, the shy girl who now played Beethoven with steady hands. Even the MC from the gala who'd grown quieter, kinder. Since that night, when they called her name, she walked to the front not with pride but with gratitude. The plaque read, "For a lifetime of quiet courage and the music that mended a town." She didn't give a speech. She just said thank you. But the real honor is getting to watch all of you find your songs. Afterward, instead of a reception, they held an impromptu concert. Leo played first, then the shy girl, then the retired fisherman with his harmonica. And finally, she sat at the borrowed piano and played. Not the Chopin, not something grand, but a simple melody she'd written herself. About roses, tea, and the sound of waves at dusk. No one recorded it. No one posted it online. It existed only in that room, in that moment, carried away on the salt air like a secret meant for the heart alone. That night, back on her porch, she didn't feel like a hero. She felt like herself, tired, content, deeply ordinary, and profoundly blessed. The years that followed weren't marked by big events, but by small constellations of connection. A student she'd taught as a child came back from college to volunteer at the youth center. A couple got engaged in the music room, saying it was the first place they'd ever truly listened to each other. Every December, the town gathered for a candlelight carol sing, and she always played the opening chords, her hands slower now, but still sure. She never wrote a memoir. She never went on tour. She never needed to. Her story lived in the way a teenager paused outside her gate to hear her practice, in the way the piano bench was always left open, in the way people in Havens Cove now said, "Let's listen," before they spoke. And one day, long after her hands could no longer press the keys, a new teacher took her place at Ellie's keys, a young woman with kind eyes and a voice like wind through reeds. She'd been one of the first students in the outreach program, the girl who'd whispered about her mother's lullabies. Now she taught the next generation not just notes, but how to listen. On her first day, she found a small envelope tucked inside the piano bench. Inside was a single sheet of music, handwritten, slightly smudged, with no title. Just a melody, simple and tender, and at the bottom, in familiar handwriting, "Play this when the room feels too quiet." She did. And the piano sang again. Back at the White House on Seabreeze Lane, the garden still bloomed. The roses still got watered with leftover tea, and if you walked by on a still evening, you might hear the soft click of knitting needles on the porch, or the murmur of a familiar voice reading aloud to no one in particular. She was older now, slower, but her eyes still held that quiet light, the kind that comes not from fame, but from living a life true to itself. She never set out to change the world. She only ever wanted to be kind, to show up, to play the music that lived inside her, even when no one was listening, and in doing that, simply, humbly, consistently, she changed everything, not with a bang, but with a note, not with words, but with presence, not for glory, but for love, and that in the end was the most real kind of magic there ever was.